"Not that table, sir." Preston Graves whispered it, but Lucas Hale had already stopped walking, and in a diner on Cranston Street in Providence, when Lucas Hale stopped, so did everyone else. Forks froze halfway to mouths. The cook quit scraping the grill. A trucker near the door found something fascinating in his coffee and didn't look up again. Everybody in that room knew who he was. 37, black wool coat. Rain still beads on his shoulders, carrying the kind of quiet that isn't peace, it's permission. Men like Lucas Hale don't raise their voices. They don't have to. He'd come in for a bathroom and a mirror. There was blood on his cuff that wasn't his, and a car idling 3 blocks down. He hadn't come in to look at anyone. Then he saw the dog, last booth, under a light that flickered like it was thinking about quitting. A Neapolitan Mastiff. Black as a closed door, 132 pounds of animal lying flat across a woman's boots. And Lucas, who'd spent 10 years reading rooms the way other men read headlines, knew instantly that something was wrong. Nobody uses a Mastiff as a guide dog. Wrong breed, wrong weight, wrong temper entirely. Then he saw the collar. Hand-braided leather, studs cut off, holes still there. That isn't a service collar, that's a fighting collar. And there was a crescent notch in that dog's left ear, a mark Lucas had seen before, 3 years ago, on a road he'd personally made sure burned to the ground. The woman never turned her head. She couldn't. Dark glasses. An army coat gone gray from too many winters. One glove worn through at the fingertip, because she needed that finger to read. 29 maybe. She was splitting a single bowl of soup, 1 spoonful for herself, 1 poured into a bottle cap on the floor. The dog ate first. The dog always ate first. She'd paid with 7 coins and $1 folded into quarters, and when the owner tried to slide that $1 back, she slid it right back the other way and said she could pay tonight. Lucas Hale had bought harbors. He'd bought judges. He had never once seen anybody defend a single $1, like it was each of themselves they still owned. So he walked over. Not for her, for the dog, for the collar, for an answer that had nothing to do with kindness. He stopped at the edge of that table. The whole room stopped breathing with him, and he asked her the one question nobody in Providence had ever heard him ask anybody. "Can I sit with you?" What he didn't know, what would take him weeks and cost him almost everything to find out, was that he was about to sit down across from the reason he could see her at all. If this one's already got hold of you, hit that like button so it can reach someone else who needs it tonight. Share it with the person who'd understand. And subscribe, we save a seat here every week. Now let's get back to that diner on Cranston Street, and to the question that changed 2 lives. She didn't turn around. She only tilted one ear toward the voice, the way a person might turn their face toward a candle in a darkened room, and in that silence Amelia Vance measured 3 things. His voice was deep, coming from a height of about 5 feet 11 inches, no more than half a step from the edge of the table, and there was no rustle of fabric accompanying it, which meant he was standing perfectly still. Men who stood that still were usually men accustomed to being listened to. In a voice as calm as though she were speaking about the weather, she told him the chair wasn't hers and that he was welcome to sit. Beneath the table, a mass of muscle shifted. Bruno didn't bark. He never barked. He only sent a very low growl up through the wooden floor, the kind of sound that didn't enter through the ears but traveled straight into the bones of the legs, and Amelia reached down, placed her palm on the crown of his head, and lightly touched 2 fingers to the hollow between his ears. The growl stopped at once. No command. Not a single word. Lucas Hale stood there and recorded that fact in his mind, as though entering a figure into a ledger. A 132-pound Mastiff was poised to spring, the muscles in its hindquarters already gathered, and it had stopped simply because a hand rested on its head. He had watched people train dogs for 20 years. He had paid the finest trainers on the East Coast Strip. No one could buy that. That wasn't training. That was something that could only grow through thousands of nights. After an animal had tested the same truth enough times to know that the hand touching it had never once lied. He pulled out the chair and sat down. The legs scraped against the floor, and throughout the room behind him, everyone who had been holding their breath began breathing again at the same time, very softly, as though the simple act of his sitting had loosened a knot someone had drawn tight around all their throats. Preston Graves remained standing with his hands clasped over his stomach, and he didn't sit. Amelia heard that. 2 men, one seated and one standing, and the standing man was breathing a little too heavily through his nose. People often forgot that discomfort had a sound of its own. Lucas didn't waste time. He asked where she had gotten the dog. The question fell flat upon the table, colorless, without even the faintest trace of feigned curiosity. Amelia was holding her spoon. She didn't set it down. She kept her hand exactly where it was and answered that he was her dog. That was all. A silence followed, lasting precisely 3 heartbeats. Lucas leaned back and Amelia heard the chair give a small creak beneath him. He said he hadn't asked whose dog it was. He had asked where it came from. She tilted her head slightly, and for the first time that evening, she turned her face fully toward him, the dark lenses of her glasses catching the warm yellow light and throwing it back. She told him he was sitting at her table, breathing her air, asking about her dog, and she hadn't even asked his name. She said she thought that was fair enough. Preston stepped forward half a pace, and Lucas raised 2 fingers from the tabletop. Only 2 fingers. Preston stopped. Amelia couldn't see the gesture, but she heard its consequence, the abrupt halt of a shoe halfway across the tiled floor, and she understood at once that the man seated before her could stop another man without speaking a single word. She had met that kind of man before. Not in boardrooms, in darker places. She lifted the spoon to her mouth, swallowed a spoonful of soup that had already gone cold, then bent down and poured a little into the bottle cap on the floor. And while she did, Lucas watched her hand. There was no searching, no hesitation. She knew exactly where the cap was, down to the inch, and she knew because she had placed it there, and she never placed it anywhere else. This woman's entire life, he thought, must be a succession of objects that weren't allowed to move. He asked her one more question, more slowly this time, and there was something very thin in his voice, something even he didn't realize had appeared. He asked whether she knew what the collar around the dog's neck meant. Amelia stopped, only for an instant, so brief that no one would have noticed it in a noisy room. But she was sitting barely 2 feet away from him, and Lucas Hale had spent 10 years learning how to read moments exactly like that. Then she said, without the slightest change in her voice, that she couldn't see his collar. She had never seen it. And she added, very softly, that there were some things a person didn't need to see to know they were old. That sentence lingered over the table longer than Preston Graves could tolerate. He had been standing for 7 minutes, and in those 7 minutes he had calculated every possible way to end this without disobeying his employer. But the woman had just said something he couldn't place into any category. There were things a person didn't need to see to know they were old. He didn't like sentences with 2 meanings beneath them. So he did what he had done for 10 years whenever a stranger sat too close to Lucas Hale. He bent down slightly, just enough for his voice to fall directly into the place where she sat, and he asked whether she knew who she was sitting in front of. Amelia heard both the question and what lay beneath it. She heard it in the tilt of his voice, in the way he pressed down on the word who, the way someone might tap a coin against a counter to prove it was real silver. She had heard that question many times before in her life. She had heard it from a benefits officer in Providence, from a night manager who drove her out of the hallway of an office building, from 2 police officers standing on a sidewalk at 4 o'clock in the morning. It always meant the same thing. It meant you stand beneath me, and I need you to admit it right now, in front of other people, or I can't be certain it's true. Amelia set down her spoon. She did it very slowly, and the sound of metal touching ceramic rang out clean, small, and precise. Then she turned her face toward Preston and said no. She said she didn't know. And she added that he had just shown her she didn't need to know, because a man who had to be introduced by someone else usually wasn't worth remembering. No one in the diner moved. The cook stood behind the counter with a spatula in his hand and forgot he was holding it. Edith Hollis, 63 years old, had stood behind that counter for 29 years and had heard nearly everything there was to hear, but she stopped with the coffee pot suspended in mid-air and didn't pour. The truck driver near the door didn't dare swallow. It wasn't because they were afraid of Preston Graves. No one was afraid of Preston Graves. They were afraid of what was about to happen to the person who had just said those words, because in this city, people who spoke that way usually weren't sitting in the same place the following week. Preston didn't move. His face didn't turn red. That was the detail Amelia found most interesting, even though she couldn't see it. She only heard it. He didn't breathe in. A man who has been insulted inhales. A man who is calculating doesn't. And in that silence came a sound Edith Hollis would describe for years afterward, though no one ever believed her. Lucas Hale laughed. It didn't laughter. It was dry and brief, rising from his chest rather than his throat, like the sound of an old door being forced out of its frame, and it stopped almost as soon as it began, as though he himself had been startled by what had escaped him. Amelia tilted her head toward the sound. She didn't understand what he was laughing at, but she heard one thing clearly. The sound had edges. It wasn't smooth. It was the sound of a muscle that hadn't been used in a very long time, and it came closer to pain than joy. This man, she thought, hadn't laughed in a very long time. Lucas knew exactly what had just happened across that table, and he knew he should stop it immediately. Preston Graves had been beside him for 10 years. Preston Graves had sat in a hospital corridor 10 years earlier when no one else had stayed. There were debts a man wasn't allowed to let others laugh at in the middle of a diner. But Lucas didn't stop it. He didn't say a word. He let that laugh remain where it was on the table, and in Lucas Hale's world, the silence of the man in the highest chair always meant agreement. Preston understood that faster than anyone else in the room. He adjusted a fold at the cuff of his sleeve, a small and natural gesture, and said in a perfectly ordinary voice that the car was waiting, sir. Then he stepped back exact 2 paces and stood still. He didn't strike back. He didn't need to. He only looked at the blind woman for another moment, memorizing her mouth, her chin, the curve of the dark lenses, the way her fingers rested on the table without trembling. He placed all of it in a corner of his mind, the place where he kept things he intended to use later. Amelia didn't know he was watching her, but she felt a very thin current of cold travel along the left side of her face, something she had learned long ago to trust, and she lifted her spoon and continued eating, slowly and calmly, like someone who had just stepped over a wire without realizing what was tied to the other end. She ate 2 more spoonfuls, then stopped, and Lucas knew she was about to say something before she even opened her mouth, because the way she rested her wrist against the edge of the table had changed. She asked whether he was hurt. The question fell between them like a stone dropped into a well, and Lucas Hale, who hadn't revealed a single wound in front of anyone for 10 years, felt the muscles along his spine tighten. He asked how she knew. Amelia didn't answer at once. She lifted the spoon, considered it, then set it down again, and Lucas realized she was deciding how much of what she knew she should allow him to know. Then she said, in an even voice without the slightest trace of display, that his breathing was uneven. The right side was shallower. She said that when people were in pain somewhere above the waist, they didn't breathe deeply enough on that side, and they compensated without realizing it by lengthening the breath on the other side, and that couldn't be hidden because it wasn't something people consciously chose to do. She said she could hear it more clearly since everything else had gone dark. Then she added that he smelled of blood. She said people often mistook it for rust. No one else in the diner heard those words. Mrs. Hollis had turned away to pour coffee. The truck driver had paid and was putting on his coat, and Preston stood 3 steps away, far enough that he couldn't catch a quietly spoken sentence. Only Lucas heard. He sat perfectly still, and inside his mind something shifted, slow and heavy, like a boulder rolling halfway over beneath the water. For 10 years, lawyers had taken his blood pressure. Lawyers had studied his face across negotiating tables, and men who had spent their entire lives observing others had sat 3 feet away from him and seen nothing. Preston Graves had stood beside him since that afternoon, had walked with him out of the warehouse 3 blocks down, had ridden beside him in the car the entire way. And Preston didn't know where he was hurting. This woman had been sitting with him for less than 15 minutes, had never seen his face, didn't know his name, and had identified exactly which rib it was. Lucas Hale didn't feel fear. He felt something far more unsettling, something he had no name for, something like standing before a mirror that, for the first time in his life, looked back at him. He said nothing more. He stood, the chair scraped backward, and every head in the diner lowered once again. He didn't say goodbye to her. He didn't thank her. He wasn't in the habit of doing either, and no one had ever asked it of him. He had taken 4 steps toward the door when her voice followed him, neither loud nor sharp, only an observation. The way someone might remind another person that their bag was open. She said he had forgotten to thank the owner. Lucas stopped. Everyone in the room heard it, and everyone immediately wished they hadn't. Mrs. Hollis stood frozen behind the counter with a dish towel in her hand, not daring to breathe, because in 29 years she had learned that in this city, people didn't remind Lucas Hale of the things he had forgotten. Preston turned his head very quickly. But Lucas didn't turn back toward Amelia. He stood in the middle of the diner with one hand already touching the door, and in those 2 seconds he made a calculation he had never once been required to make in his life. Then he turned, not toward Amelia, but toward the counter. He looked directly at Edith Hollis, the 63-year-old woman clutching a towel, and rooted to the spot, and he thanked her. Only 3 words. His voice didn't change. Nothing in it softened. But Mrs. Hollis would remember those 3 words for the rest of her life. And she would tell them to exactly one person, on a rainy night, many months later, when she decided to pick up the telephone and call someone instead of calling the police. She only nodded. She couldn't speak. Lucas pushed open the door and walked out. Preston followed. The door closed behind them, and the rain swallowed them whole. Inside the diner, someone began talking again. The spatula scraped across the griddle. Amelia remained still in the last booth, one hand resting on Bruno's head, and she listened as the car started outside and glided away through the water. She didn't know who the man was. She had no intention of finding out. She recorded only one thing and stored it away, the way she stored everything, in a fixed place where nothing was permitted to move. That man had stopped. People didn't stop unless they were listening. And outside, in the car, Lucas Hale sat in the back seat, watching water stream across the window, and didn't say a single word for 8 blocks, because he had just realized that for the past 10 years, no one had truly seen him, and he hadn't known how deeply he had missed that feeling. By the 9th block, Lucas took out his phone and called Tobias Rend. Toby answered after one ring, his voice still thick with sleep, 33 years old, and long since accustomed to the fact that when this number appeared at 11 o'clock at night, a man didn't ask why. Lucas said he needed information about a dog. There was a brief silence on the other end, exactly the kind of silence made by someone making certain he hadn't misheard, and then Toby said, "Yes, sir." Lucas described the collar, the nail holes, the crescent-shaped notch in the left ear, and he said 3 words, Quarry Road, and heard Toby sit bolt upright in the darkness. Lucas said he didn't care how long it took. Then he ended the call. Rain tapped against the roof of the car in an uneven rhythm. The back sight 16 inches away from him, Preston Graves sat with his spine straight and both hands resting on his knees, and Preston said that a dog that had been dead for 3 years wasn't worth losing an evening over. The words came out too quickly. Lucas didn't turn his head. He kept watching the water stream across the glass, but inside his mind, something had just been recorded, sharp and clean as the sound of a spoon touching ceramic at the last table earlier that night. He had never told Preston the dog was dead. He hadn't told anyone. He hadn't even known it himself. He had only described a collar and an ear. He counted slowly in his head, and he couldn't find a single sentence from that evening that could have led Preston to conclude the animal was supposed to be dead. Then Lucas turned and looked at him. He looked for a long time, longer than was comfortable, longer than necessary, the kind of look he used across negotiating tables when he wanted the man opposite him to fill the silence on his own. Preston didn't. Preston simply met his gaze, his face calm and perfectly ordinary, then tilted his head slightly as though waiting for an instruction. And Lucas thought perhaps he was tired. Perhaps it had only been a figure of speech. People said a dead dog the way they spoke of old business. He turned back toward the window and let it pass, but it didn't pass entirely. It merely sank. The web check, a heavy object, sinks to the bottom and lies there waiting. 4 days later, Toby called back, and his voice didn't sound like the voice of a man who had just finished an easy job. He said he had found the kennel ledger. Quarry Road had kept a handwritten book in ballpoint ink, stored on no computer anywhere, and it had been sitting inside a plastic box at the home of a man who had moved to Florida. Toby said Lucas wasn't going to like this. The dog was number 41, a male Neapolitan Mastiff, brought in from a place in Pennsylvania, and in the final column of that entry were 3 initials used throughout the industry, and those 3 letters meant disposed of. Toby told him plainly what that meant. It meant the dog was dead. The date written in the ledger was a night exactly 3 years ago. Lucas remained still for a long time, and inside his mind, that memory rose to its feet without anyone calling it forward. He knew exactly which night it had been. He knew because he was the one who had given the order. 3 years earlier, on a March night, he had sat inside a different car on a different road and spoken one brief sentence, and 6 hours later Quarry Road had been reduced to ashes and blackened posts, and he hadn't thought about it even once since. He asked Toby whether anyone had taken the dog out beforehand. Toby said no. Toby said the ledger clearly showed it had been disposed of before the fire, and the men there had no reason to lie. In a book they believed no one would ever read, because they had recorded everything else in it, including things that could have sent them to prison for 15 years. Then Toby said the words that made Lucas rise from his chair. He asked that if the dog had died on March 11, 2023, what exactly had been lying beneath the table at Hollis' kitchen the previous Tuesday night. Beyond the window, Providence rain fell across the rooftops of Federal Hill and ran down toward the harbor. Lucas Hale stood there with the phone in his hand, and for the first time in 10 years, he felt that old and familiar sensation, the feeling of a man who had just realized there was a night in his own life when he hadn't remained long enough to learn what had truly happened. He told Toby to keep digging. He didn't tell Preston. On that night 3 years ago, Amelia Vance was 26 years old and had perhaps 1/10 of the world left to her. She slept in an abandoned woodworking shop about a quarter mile from Quarry Road, on a foam mattress she had dragged out of a garbage dump, and what remained of her sight then was like looking through a sheet of frozen glass. She could tell light from darkness, could sense where a shape was moving, and nothing more. She had learned to live through other things. She knew there were 17 steps from the mattress to the door of that workshop, and she never placed her water bottle anywhere else. The first explosion came shortly before 1 o'clock in the morning, and it didn't sound like an explosion. It sounded as though someone had slammed an enormous door somewhere very far away, and the floor beneath her back trembled once, then went still. She sat up. Then the smell arrived. It wasn't burning wood. She knew that smell. This was something else. Oil and plastic, and something harshly sweet that scraped at her throat. And she knew at once that it wasn't an accident, because accidents didn't smell that deliberate. She followed the wall to the door and stood there, and the wind carried toward her the sounds she would carry for the rest of her life. Dogs. Many of them, but they weren't barking. She had lived close enough to Quarry Road for long enough to know what sounds came from that place at night, and this was different. This was higher, thinner, and it didn't stop to draw breath. Amelia stood in the doorway and recognized the sound. She recognized it because she had made it herself 3 years earlier, in a hospital corridor in Boston, when they told her the sight in her remaining eye was fading and there was nothing anyone could do, and she had sat down on the floor and made exactly that sound. It wasn't the sound of pain. Was brief. It was the sound of something that had just understood it was about to be left behind, and that no one was coming back for it. She went. She didn't decide to go. She simply realized that she was already moving, barefoot across frozen ground, one hand reaching into the darkness of her, a quarter mile through the smoke. She crawled through a cut in the fence because she heard the wind passing through a wide opening, and the wind didn't lie. Inside, it was hot and blind. The 1/10 of sight she still possessed was completely useless there. All she could see was a vague orange glow, rising and falling, so she closed her eyes, and everything became easier at once. She followed the sound. Some of the kennels had already fallen silent, and she passed them quickly, refusing to let herself stop there. Then she reached the place where the sound was still alive, and her hands found the bars, and behind them was a mass of flesh so large that her hands couldn't find its edges. The latch was so hot she had to pull it with the hem of her shirt. She opened it. The animal didn't run. That was the thing she wouldn't understand for many years afterward. It didn't run. It stood there, and when she reached inside to find its neck, it bit her. It closed its jaws around her went forearm, and it bit hard, and Amelia didn't scream. She only heard the rhythm of her own breathing change. She didn't pull her arm away. She left it inside the animal's jaws and said, her voice rough from the smoke, that she was losing everything too, and if it came with her, then they could lose it together. She didn't know why she said those words. They weren't a command. They weren't meant to soothe. They were simply true, and perhaps that was why. Its jaws loosened. She found the collar, braided leather as stiff as rope, and she pulled, and it followed her, 132 pounds bearing down against her, as the two of them dragged themselves out through the same opening in the fence, and outside, the air was below freezing, and she lay on her back on the ground, with the dog sprawled across her legs, and they breathed together. About 130 feet away, higher on the slope, 2 men stood beside a car. They had been there for an hour. They saw her. They watched a thin, barefoot woman, with blood running from her arm, drag a dog out of the fire, and one of the men drew on his cigarette and said to leave it alone, that the order had been to burn the kennels and not touch anyone. The other man nodded. They watched her rise, walk away into the smoke, and they never spoke of it again, not because they were hiding anything, but because that night it hadn't mattered. It hadn't mattered to anyone. No one told Lucas Hale that a blind woman had crawled into his fire and carried out the only living thing left inside. 3 years later, she placed her hand on its head beneath a table on Cranston Street, and it stopped growling, and she still carried the crescent-shaped scar on her left forearm, exactly where its teeth had sunk into her on the night she refused to let go. At 9 o'clock on Thursday night, the diner door opened, and Edith Hollis looked up and nearly dropped the coffee pot. He had come alone. There was no car parked across the entrance. No man with salt and pepper hair standing by the door with both hands clasped over his stomach. No one at all. Just a man in a wet coat, and this time the diner didn't freeze. It merely lowered its voice, and Mrs. Hollis thought that was even stranger. Lucas didn't walk straight to the last table. He went to the counter. He stood gwagged on the board on the wall as though he were truly reading it, then said he would have 2 bowls. Mrs. Hollis opened her mouth to ask a question, then didn't. She ladled out 2 bowls. She set them on a tray and realized her hands were trembling slightly, and she was angry with herself for it, because she was 63 years old, had stood behind that counter for 29 years, and wasn't in the habit of trembling. Lucas paid. He left the change on the counter without saying anything. He picked up the tray and carried it across the room. He walked slowly, and everyone pretended not to watch. Amelia heard him from 4 tables away. She heard the rhythm of his steps, and she had stored it since Tuesday night in that fixed place where nothing was allowed to move, so she didn't need to think. She knew at once. Before he could set down the tray, she said he hadn't brought the other man with him. Lucas paused for half a beat, then he said no. He placed 1 bowl in front of her. Amelia didn't reach for it. She kept both hands resting on the table and pushed the bowl back toward him, not hard, only enough to slide it beyond her reach, and said she didn't accept food from people whose names she didn't know. Mrs. Hollis, standing in the middle of the aisle with the coffee pot in her hand, froze where she was. Someone in the diner coughed once, then went silent as though he had made a mistake. Lucas looked at the bowl of soup she had pushed back toward him. For the past 10 years, grown men had waited with 3 weeks merely for the chance to sit at the same table with him, and this woman had just returned a $4 bowl of soup. He sat down. He said, "Lucas." Amelia tilted her head. She asked if it was only Lucas. He said for today that was all. She considered that longer than he expected. Then she reached out, found the rim of the bowl, and pulled it back toward herself. But she didn't eat. She picked up the spoon and did something Lucas Hale hadn't prepared for. She scooped, divided, and poured half of her soup into the other bowl, working very slowly and precisely, her left index finger resting lightly on the rim so she could tell how high the liquid had risen, without spilling a single drop. Then she pushed that bowl toward him. She said they would share. She said strangers came to a little less strange when they shared a meal. Lucas looked down at the bowl. He was the man who had paid for both bowls of soup on that table. He could buy the entire diner, the whole building, the entire neighborhood before sunrise, and the woman sitting across from him had just given him half of what he had given her, and she had done it as though it were the only reasonable thing in the world. He didn't understand why his throat felt the way it did. He picked up the spoon. Before taking a single bite, Amelia bent down. She poured a little soup into the bottle cap beneath the table. Bruno ate first. Bruno always ate first. Lucas watched the movement and thought of a handwritten ledger in ballpoint ink, of 3 initials in the final column, of March 11th, 2023, and he didn't ask. He had intended to ask all afternoon. He had prepared 3 different ways to do it. But he sat there and watched her feed the dog first, and he didn't ask. They ate in silence. Mrs. Hollis returned to the counter and stood there with the coffee pot in her hand, pouring for no one, simply standing and watching the 2 people at the last table share 2 bowls of soup beneath the yellow light that still flickered as though considering whether to give up. She had seen many things at that table. She had seen people end relationships there, cry there, fall asleep there. She had never seen Lucas Hale eat there. Near the end, Amelia said he was eating so slowly than he had the night before. Lucas said he hadn't eaten the night before. She said she knew. She said that was why she had mentioned it. She offered no further explanation, and he asked no further questions. And outside, Providence rain fell across Cranston Street and ran toward the harbor, where things that belonged to him were being unloaded in the darkness. And for roughly 20 minutes on that Thursday night, Lucas Hale forgot them completely. On Friday morning, Preston Graves entered the office on Federal Hill at 7:15, 45 minutes before Lucas, placed a gray file folder on the desk, sat down in the chair across from it, and waited. He said nothing when Lucas came in. He let the folder speak first. Lucas looked at it and didn't touch it. He removed his coat, hung it up, poured himself coffee, sat down, and only then did he draw the folder toward him with 2 fingers. Preston began speaking, and his voice was the voice of a man reading a balance sheet. Amelia Vance, 29 years old, born in Woonsocket. Mother died in 2011. No permanent address for the past 6 years. Arrested twice, both times for trespassing, both times inside unoccupied houses, and released after one night on both occasions because no one could be bothered to prosecute. Preston said that meant nothing. It only proved she had nowhere to sleep. Then he turned to the second page. She had applied for disability benefits 3 times. She had been denied all 3 times. Preston read the exact reason printed in the most recent rejection letter, words typed on paper and dry as sand, stating that the medical documentation was insufficient to establish a level of functional impairment meeting federal standards. He folded that page closed. He said the dog had no documentation at all. No training school, no registration, not a single piece of paper. He said that in this state, a person didn't need papers to bring a guide dog into a diner, but the dog did have to be trained, and if someone wanted to make trouble, all it would take was 1 call to the city health department, and that woman would be turned away from every doorway within 4 blocks before the weekend was over. He said it calmly. He didn't say he intended to do it. He merely said the possibility existed. Then he pushed the final page forward, and he didn't read it aloud. He let Lucas read it for himself. For nearly a year leading up to her departure 10 years ago, Amelia Vance worked as a tissue processing technician at Northeast Tissue and Eye Services in Boston. Employment ended in June of 2016. Reason listed in personnel records, medical reasons. Lucas read the line twice. He never lifted his eyes, but Preston saw what he needed to see. The moment Lucas's hand stopped in the middle of the page, and Preston exactly 3 seconds before speaking, he said, "Sir, listen to this the way an outsider would hear it. A blind woman, a fighting dog bearing the mark of a kennel you personally burned down, and a past at a tissue bank in Boston. Those 3 things sit at the same table, in the very diner you visited once in your life, on the exact night you had business at the harbor." Preston said it wasn't a coincidence. He said it was a setup. The heater hummed in the room. Lucas said nothing. Preston didn't need him to. He knew how statements like that worked. A man didn't believe them immediately. He simply couldn't forget them. Preston rose, fastened the button of his suit jacket, and delivered his final words in the voice one used when handing medicine to someone with a fever. He said, 10 years ago, when you were lying there and no one knew whether you would ever open your eyes again, I was the one who signed the papers. I was the one who sat in the hallway. I haven't asked for anything. But I am asking you for one thing, sir. Don't let a stranger know more about you than I do." Then he walked out and closed the door very softly behind him. Lucas sat alone with the gray folder open on his desk. He read the line again. Northeast Tissue and Eye Services. He had lived 10 years without allowing himself to think about that name, and now it lay on his desk, printed in black ink inside a file about a woman who sat at the last table of a diner on Cranston Street and divided her bowl of soup in half for him. He thought about how she had known which rib was hurting. He thought about how she had known he hadn't eaten the night before. He thought about how she was the only person in 10 years who had been able to read him, and until that morning, he had considered it a small miracle. Now another possibility lay beside it, gray and orderly as the folder itself. Perhaps someone who could read him with such precision had already read about him before. Lucas Hale thought there for a very long time. Then he closed the folder, and he didn't call Toby, and he didn't call anyone at all, and that was the first time he had done such a thing in 10 years. He arrived at 9 o'clock. He still bought 2 bowls, because his hands had done it before his mind could stop them, and he carried the tray across the room while Mrs. Haswoli watched him and knew at once that something was wrong. The man was walking differently. On Thursday night, he had walked slowly. Tonight, he walked straight ahead. Amelia heard that rhythm and knew it too. She had stored the sound of his footsteps in its fixed place, and tonight it didn't fit. And when something in a fixed place no longer fit, to Amelia Vance it always meant danger. She didn't turn her head. She kept both hands on the table. He set down the tray and didn't sit, and that was wrong too, and she counted 3 seconds before he spoke. He asked whether she had worked at Northeast Tissue. His voice didn't sound the way it had on Thursday night. It was flat and dry, and he wasn't because he wanted to know. He was asking to confirm something. Amelia didn't move. She said she had, once. Lucas sat down. He placed both hands on the tabletop and asked the second question, the one he had carried in the car for 14 hours, and it came out more cleanly than he intended. He asked who was paying her to sit there. Somewhere in the diner, someone dragged a chair. The yellow light above them flickered once. Amelia was holding her spoon. She set it down, and she did it very slowly, even more slowly than the night she had set it down in front of Preston Graves. And the sound of metal touching ceramic rang out, and for that moment, it was the only sound in the diner. Then she turned her face toward him. She said, "Mr. Hale." She said she had figured out his name. People spoke it when they thought he wasn't listening. They said it in this place all the time. They said it in the same voice people used when talking about bad weather. She said she had known since Tuesday night. But she hadn't spoken it because she thought that if he wanted her to know, he would have told her. Then she said the rest. She said she sat there because it was the only diner within 4 blocks that didn't throw her out. She said that on the east side. People called the police when they saw her, that at the place with the green neon sign. They said they were sorry, but they didn't allow dogs, and that at the bakery on Broad Street. They let her sit for 15 minutes before sending a young employee out to tell her in a very kind voice that a customer had complained. She said Mrs. Hollis had never asked her a single question. Not one. Not in 3 years. Then she tilted her head and spoke the final words, no louder than the ones before them, without the slightest bitterness, and that was exactly why they cut so deeply. She said she had been sitting at that table before he even knew the chair existed. She said he was the one who had come later. Lucas Hale couldn't find anything to say. He had sat through 3 negotiations where the other side placed guns on the table. He had sat through a federal trial. He had never sat through this. Amelia reached down, touched the bottle cap, picked it up, and slipped it in the pocket of her coat, and Lucas watched the gesture and understood that she was gathering her things. She stood. She told Mrs. Hollis she was going home, and the voice she used with her was completely ordinary, warm, and that ordinariness made it worse. Mrs. Hollis said something Lucas couldn't quite hear. Amelia placed one hand on Bruno's shoulder, and he rose, 132 pounds lifting silently from the floor, and the two of them walked out. She counted her steps. She didn't bump into anything. The whole diner watched them leave, and no one said a word. The door opened. Rain came in. The door closed. Lucas remained seated with 2 bowls of soup. One was his. The other was the bowl he had just bought for someone who was already gone. The yellow light flickered. Mrs. Hollis stood behind the counter with a towel in her hand, and she didn't come to clear the table. She simply stood there, and Lucas realized that the 63-year-old woman was deliberately leaving those 2 bowls in front of him. He wasn't angry with her. He had no right to be. He sat at the last table in Hollis' kitchen for 15 minutes without eating, without standing, watching the steam rise from the untouched bowl, grow thinner and finally disappear. And inside his mind there was only one sentence repeating itself again and again. It wasn't the sentence about Northeast Tissue. It wasn't what Preston had said about a setup. He was the one who had come later. She had sat in that chair for 3 years. For 3 years, he passed along Krantz Street twice a week inside a car with darkened windows, and had never once known the diner existed. Lucas Hale, a man who had bought entire harbors, sat there and understood that he had just lost something before he had even realized it was his. Preston Graves met the 2 men in the parking lot of a grocery store in Cranston at 10 o'clock on Monday morning, and the entire meeting lasted 4 minutes. He didn't give them his name. He didn't need to. He handed them $200 in cash, divided evenly, $100 for each man, and he told them very clearly that no one was to touch her. He emphasized that part. Don't touch her. He said she simply needed to lose the place where she slept. He said people like that left on their own once one or two things were taken away. The two men nodded. They had done far worse things for far less money. Preston drove back to Federal Hill and didn't tell Lucas. And he told himself that this was the work of a consigliere, clearing away small matters so his employer wouldn't have to think about them. And he had been telling himself that for 10 years, and it still worked. Beneath the Point Street Bridge. The rain had become the cold rain of late November, the kind that didn't fall straight down but crawled sideways. Amelia had slept there for 5 nights, ever since the evening she walked out of the diner. There were 11 steps from where she lay to the concrete pillar, and she had her sleeping bag, and she had Bruno, and in 3 years she had learned that those 3 things together were enough. She woke when Bruno stood up. There was no growl. He never growled when something was truly wrong. She heard his body lift from the concrete, heard his claws turn at a right angle, and heard him take 2 steps forward and place himself between her and something to the north. And she sat up sharply and saw nothing at all, only the darkness she had lived inside for 3 years. Then she heard shoes. 2 men. They weren't hurrying. Men who hurried came to take something. Men who walked slowly came because someone hadn't paid them. She heard the cap being twisted from a plastic can, and the smell came immediately afterward, and Amelia knew that smell. She had known it 3 years earlier on a road called Quarry Road, and for 1 second she wasn't certain where she was or what year it was. She screamed for them not to do it. She screamed as loudly as she could. Then came the click of a lighter, then the sound of fabric catching fire, that quick breath of flame, and heat struck the left side of her face, and she heard her sleeping bag, the only thing that had kept her alive through 3 winters, turn into sound. She crawled toward it, and someone pushed her back, not hard, only a hand against her shoulder pressing her away, and Amelia fell onto the wet concrete. Then Bruno moved. She didn't see him go. She heard him. She heard 132 pounds launch forward, heard a man curse, heard shoes sliding across the concrete, and heard the sounds that followed, sounds she would never be able to describe to anyone, not even many years later. Not even to the only person who ever asked. She could only listen. She couldn't see anything. That was the worst part, and she would carry it for the rest of her life. She sat 6 feet away in absolute darkness and didn't know what was happening to the only thing she had left. Then the footsteps ran away. They grew fainter. A car door, an engine, then nothing. The rain returned to fill the emptiness, and the sleeping bag was still burning, and beneath the sound of the flames, Amelia heard something else. Bruno was breathing, but he was breathing wrong. She had listened to that dog breathe every night for 3 years. She knew the rhythm of his breathing when he slept, when he dreamed, when he was hot, when he had grown a little older. This belonged to none of those. It was short, and it stopped halfway through, and every time it stopped, Amelia stopped breathing with him. She crawled. The wet concrete scraped her knees. She reached ahead of herself, left then right, and struck a pillar, but she didn't stop. She called his name. Then she said, her voice breaking apart, "Say something." "Please," she said, "I can't see you." She repeated it. "I can't see you, so you have to say something, please." She crawled another 3 feet, and her hand touched wet fur, and she pressed both palms against him and felt his chest rise very slowly, then fall, and Amelia Vance, who hadn't cried when they told her the sight in her remaining eye was fading, who hadn't cried when her disability application was denied for the 3rd time, sat on the pavement beneath the Point Street Bridge, in the freezing rain, held her dog's head against her, and wept like a child, because he was still breathing, and because there was no way in this world for her to know how badly he was hurting her. A man walking home from the night shift heard the crying beneath the bridge and didn't stop. But at 12:40, he went into Hollis' kitchen to buy coffee, and he mentioned it the way people mentioned the weather, saying that someone was screaming beneath the Point Street Bridge. Edith Hollis set down the coffee pot. She asked whether it was a woman. The man shrugged. Mrs. Hollis had stood behind that counter for 29 years, and in those 20 years she had called the police exactly 4 times. And she knew precisely what happened when the police found a homeless person with an undocumented dog at 1 o'clock in the morning. No one rescued anyone. They filed a report called Animal Control, and by morning the dog was in a kennel, and the woman was sitting in a plastic chair, and the 2 of them never saw each other again. Mrs. Hollis knew that, so she didn't call the police. She opened the drawer beneath the cash register, and took out a scrap of paper a man had left on the counter with his change on Thursday night. A piece of paper bearing 10 numbers and no name, and she had carried it for 4 days without knowing why she was keeping it. She dialed the number. It rang twice. A man's voice answered. Mrs. Hollis didn't introduce herself. She said the woman was beneath the Point Street Bridge. Then she spoke the words she had spent 20 seconds considering before she dialed, and her voice didn't tremble at all. 63 years old, her hands still smelling of coffee. She said, "I didn't call the police. I called you," she said, "because this is the kind of thing that belongs to you." The man on the other end said nothing. She heard a chair scrape backward very quickly, then footsteps, and she ended the call. She stood in the empty diner without knowing whether she had just done the right thing or the worst thing she had ever done. She would never be entirely certain, not even many years later. The car arrived 19 minutes later. Lucas Hale got out alone. He hadn't brought anyone with him. He walked down the concrete slope through the rain, leather shoes sinking into mud, and the first thing he smelled was the remains of burned fabric after the flames had died. And the second thing he saw, beneath the yellow light of a street lamp nearly 100 feet away, was a woman sitting on the wet pavement, her hair plastered against her face, both arms wrapped around the neck of an animal, too large for her to lift. She was trying to lift him. That was what Lucas would never forget. She wasn't crying for help, and she wasn't sitting there waiting. She was trying to work her arms beneath 132 pounds of flesh, with 2 limbs that weren't strong enough, and no one knew how long she had been trying. He said nothing. He removed his black wool coat and laid it across her shoulders, and she startled because she hadn't heard him approach, and she turned her face toward him and opened her mouth, but he had already moved around her, and knelt in the mud in a $3,000 suit. He slid one arm beneath the dog's chest and the other beneath his hips, and he lifted. 132 pounds. Something tore in his back, and he didn't stop. Bruno didn't bite. He only breathed out once and allowed himself to be carried. Amelia heard every one of those sounds, understood what was happening, and rose to her feet, her legs trembling, and she reached out before her, and found nothing, only rain. And for 1 second she stood completely alone in absolute darkness without knowing which direction to take. Then she heard. He had stopped. He was holding 132 pounds in his arms, and he had stopped. He stood there waiting, and he didn't say a single word, and Amelia understood immediately. She stepped forward. She reached out and found the wet hem of his suit jacket, and she held it between 2 fingers. And it was the first time in 3 years that Amelia Vance had touched another human being for a reason, other than to avoid colliding with them. He walked, slowly. He walked more slowly than necessary because someone was holding the hem of his jacket and counting her steps. Up the slope, through the mud, to the car. He laid the dog across the back seat, and Amelia climbed inside and sat on the floor beside him. Not on the seat, but on the floor, one hand resting on his chest, and she said nothing, and Lucas said nothing. He drove, not one of his men, he drove himself, 35 minutes south on Interstate 95 toward Warwick, to the only place in the state open 24 hours a day. And throughout those 35 minutes, Lucas Hale didn't speak a single word. And in the rearview mirror, he watched a woman sitting on the floor of his car in his black coat, drenched to the skin, counting a dog's breaths with the palm of her hand, and he held his speed at exactly 53 miles per hour and didn't think once about anything Preston Graves had told him on Friday morning. The veterinarian on night duty came out at 3:40 in the morning and said that the dog was going to be all right. 2 broken ribs on the left side, neither displaced, no punctured lung, and she delivered the final sentence while looking directly at Amelia, even though Amelia couldn't look back. She said he would be in pain for 6 weeks and wouldn't let anyone know it, because dogs of that breed didn't cry out. Amelia nodded. She sat on a blue plastic chair bolted to the wall, still wearing the man's oversized black wool coat, her hair still wet, and she hadn't moved in 40 minutes. Lucas paid at the counter. He used a card, and the employee asked for the pet owner's name, and he stood there for a second before saying Amelia Vance, then spelled the last name, and it was the first time in his life he had spoken that name aloud. Then he returned to the hallway and sat down on the plastic chair 1 seat away from her. 4 o'clock in the morning. The fluorescent light overhead made a thin sound no one would have noticed during the day. Somewhere beyond the double doors, a machine was counting out a rhythm. Outside, the rain had stopped. They sat that way for 10 minutes. Then Lucas spoke without turning his head, addressing the empty space in front of him, and asked why she hadn't abandoned the dog. He said it ate more than she did. It was a cruel thing to say, and he knew it. But he wasn't asking because he wanted to hurt her. He was asking because he truly didn't understand, because in the entire system Lucas Hale had used to read people for 10 years, a person who had nothing and still kept something that consumed more food than she did was an entry that wouldn't balance, and he had spent 40 minutes trying to make it balance. Amelia didn't answer at once. She sat still with both hands resting in her lap, and he thought perhaps she wouldn't answer at all. Then she said, her voice rough from smoke and crying, that she knew what it felt like to be left behind when she couldn't see the person leaving her. She said nothing more. She didn't tell him any story. She didn't say who had left her, or when, or where. She simply let that sentence lie there on the final floor of the hallway, and it filled the entire space. Lucas Hale sat very still. There were some things a man couldn't answer with money, and he had spent 10 years making certain he would never have to hear one of them. And now he was sitting on a plastic chair at 4 o'clock in the morning in Warwick, and he had just heard it. The silence stretched on. The light hummed, and then Lucas did something he hadn't intended, hadn't prepared, hadn't calculated, something he would never later be able to explain even to himself. He said he had once nearly gone blind. Amelia turned her head, only slightly. She said nearly. He said yes. He looked at the double doors. He said it had been 10 years ago. He said they had told him it was over. He said he remembered that week because it was the only week of his life when he hadn't been able to decide anything for himself, when he had lain there while other people decided everything, and he had hated that more than the pain. Then he spoke the final sentence, very softly, almost as though he weren't saying it to her at all. He said someone had given him a piece of their eye. Amelia went rigid. Not through movement. The opposite. Every movement in her body stopped at once. The hands resting in her lap became completely still. Her shoulders, which had been trembling slightly from the cold for 40 minutes, stopped. She didn't breathe in. Lucas wasn't looking at her, so he didn't see any of it. He was watching the double doors and thinking about another hallway 10 years earlier, too occupied with his own disbelief that he had just told such a thing to a stranger. Amelia sat within her absolute darkness, and inside that darkness something had begun to fall, very slowly, from a great height. She said nothing. She didn't ask when. She didn't ask which eye. She didn't ask where, which hospital, or who. She had worked for 11 months inside a cold room, kept at 39 degrees Fahrenheit in Boston, and she knew exactly how those rules worked. She knew the donor was never allowed to know the recipient, and the recipient was never allowed to know the donor. She knew there were thousands of people in the world seeing through a piece of someone else, and not one of them knew that person's name. She knew the odds were impossible, and she knew that if she asked even one question, she would have to live with the answer. So she didn't ask. She sat on the blue plastic chair in his coat, and she didn't ask, and the fluorescent light hummed, and somewhere beyond the double doors a dog was breathing slowly and evenly beneath anesthesia. And outside, dawn was beginning to rise over Warwick. He didn't ask whether she wanted to. He knew that if he asked, she would say no, so he simply told her there was a place on Federal Hill. On the 3rd floor, where no one lived, and it was closer to the veterinary hospital than the underside of the Point Street Bridge. And if she wanted the dog examined again on Friday, that was the only way. He said it in the voice of a man reading out a schedule. Amelia sat still for a very long time. Then she asked how long. He said 6. All right, 6 weeks, placing emphasis on the word 6. And Lucas understood that she had just signed a contract with an expiration date and had no intention of renewing it. The apartment was empty. Not empty in the sense that no one had ever lived there, but empty in the way a place becomes when someone has moved it out and never returned. Hardwood floors, a table, a bed, a refrigerator, humming in the kitchen. Lucas opened the door and stepped aside, and Amelia stood at the threshold without entering immediately. She stood there and listened. He watched her do it and wouldn't understand until many months later that she was measuring the room by sound. High ceiling, no carpet. The refrigerator was on the right, about 23 feet away. Then she stepped inside and followed the wall, her right hand touching it lightly, and she made a complete circuit while counting. Bruno limped behind her, slowly, then lay down in the exact center of the living room floor and didn't take another step. Lucas said the bed was in the other room. Amelia thanked him. He left at 11 o'clock that night, and when he returned at 7 the following morning with coffee, he found her lying on the hardwood floor, wrapped in his black wool coat, her back pressed against the dog's. The bed in the other room remained perfectly undisturbed. He stood there holding 2 cups of coffee and didn't understand. He asked why she hadn't slept in the bed. Amelia turned over, sat up, and answered as though it were the simplest question in the world. She said she would have to get used to the bed. She said once you got used to something, losing it hurt more than never having it at all. Lucas Hale stood in the middle of his own apartment and couldn't find anything to say. He owned 4 houses. He slept in 3 different ones every week, and not one of them contained a single photograph. For 10 years, he had told himself it was strategy, that no one could take from him what he had never allowed himself to become attached to. And now a woman sitting on his floor had spoken that exact rule in 9 words, without having any idea whom she was describing. He set the coffee down on the table and said nothing. They had to leave at 9. Friday, the follow-up examination, and he had arranged a car. He carried his empty coffee cup away, opened the door, and then did what anyone would have done. He reached out, took hold of her left wrist and pulled. Amelia stopped at once. She didn't wrench herself free, she simply became still, her entire body turning into a break, and Lucas saw his hand suspended in the air with her wrist still inside it. She said no, 1 word, and there was something inside that single word that made him release her immediately. Then she told him to offer his elbow. He didn't understand. She repeated it patiently, with the patience of someone who had been forced to explain the same thing 300 times to 300 different people. She told him to extend his left elbow, bend it, hold it level with his hip, and not raise it. He did. She reached out, searched, touched his forearm, slid her hand upward to his elbow, and closed her fingers around the joint, her thumb on the outside and her other 4 fingers inside, without tightening her grip. Then she stepped back half a pace and stood slightly behind him on his right, and she told him to walk. He walked. After 3 steps, he stopped because he felt something he had never felt in his life. Someone was walking half a step behind him, and he wasn't pulling her, yet she was still there. He asked what the difference was. Amelia said that when he pulled her, he decided where she went. She said this way, she was still the one choosing to go. She said he was only telling her where the ground was. Then she continued calmly, telling him that when he reached a stair, he didn't need to say stair. He only needed to pause for half a beat, and she would know because his arm would lower before hers did, and she could read that faster than he could say it. Lucas stood in the doorway of the 3rd-floor apartment on Federal Hill, with a blind woman resting her hand on his elbow, and inside his mind was a sentence he didn't speak and wouldn't speak for many months. And in 10 years he had never allowed anyone to walk behind him. Then he moved forward slowly, and at the first stair he paused for half a beat, and she stepped down with him without stumbling, while Bruno limped behind them, 132 pounds, 2 broken ribs, and not a single sound. The Tuesday dinner was fixed, unchanged for 10 years, and Lucas invited her to come, and even much later he still wouldn't know whether he had invited her because he wanted her there, or because he wanted to see what would happen. 6 people sat at the long table. Lucas at the head, Preston Graves to his right, Tobias Wren near the far end, 2 capos between them, and Amelia Vance across from Preston, able to tell the table was at least 13 feet long because the sound of knives and forks from the other end took a fraction of a second to reach her ears. Bruno lay at her feet, and no one said a word about the fact that there was a mastiff in Lucas Hale's dining room. The first 30 minutes were ordinary. They talked about the harbor, about a contract in New Bedford, about the price of oil. Amelia ate slowly, and she ate perfectly, never touching anything she hadn't placed there herself, and one of the 2 capos watched her do it and couldn't hide his surprise. Then Preston set down his glass and spoke. He didn't speak loudly. He used the voice people used when telling an interesting story at the dinner table. He said Miss Vance had once worked at a tissue bank. He let that sit for 3 seconds. Then he said he found it amusing. A tissue bank technician dining in the home of a man who had once received tissue from a tissue bank. He said she was exactly the kind of person who knew what every part of a man was worth. The entire table went silent. Toby stopped chewing. One capo looked at Lucas, and Lucas looked at no one. He sat back in his chair with both hands on the table and didn't say a word. And later he would wonder whether he had stayed silent out of respect for her or out of cowardice. Amelia set down her knife, then her fork. She did it slowly and precisely, and the sound of metal touching porcelain rang twice through the silent dining room. She turned her face toward the voice. She said, "Mr. Graves." She said she had worked there for 11 months. She said the processing room was kept at 39 degrees Fahrenheit. She said they gave her a coat and she was still cold. Everyone was cold. No one ever got used to it. She said her job was labeling. She said every label carried a number, and beneath that number, on the accompanying sheet she had to verify, there was a name, a real name. She asked whether he knew what that meant. It meant that every morning, she read the names of people who had died within the previous 12 hours. She said there had been someone who was 31, someone who was 68, someone who was 19. She said she remembered all of them, and she didn't want to remember. Then she said the second part, and her voice didn't rise, it only slowed. She said that somewhere out there, on that same night, there was a family. She said they had just heard the worst thing one human being could ever hear. She said that in that hour, in the worst hour of their entire lives, someone in a white coat came to stand beside them and asked a question, and they said yes. She told him to imagine what it took to say yes in that hour. She said she had seen their signatures. Some trembled so badly that the names couldn't be read. One of them, she said, had been signed twice because the hand wouldn't obey the first time. She stopped. No one in the dining room moved. Toby Payrend lowered his face toward his plate and didn't raise it again. One of the two capos, a 50-year-old man who had done things the newspapers would never know, set down his wineglass very gently, as though afraid of making noise. Then Amelia spoke the final words. She said he had asked whether she knew what each part was worth. She said none of it was worth anything. She said it was given. She said he couldn't understand that, so he called it a price, because that was the only word he had. Then she turned her face directly toward where he sat, the dark lenses catching the candlelight, and she said, "The poorest person in this room isn't me, sir. It's the only person here who can't imagine a gift without an invoice." No one said anything. The clock in the hallway struck once, and it sounded like an act of rudeness. Preston Graves sat upright with his napkin in his lap, his face completely calm, and he didn't flush and he didn't breathe in. He simply sat there and looked at her, and after about 5 seconds he said very politely that he apologized if he had made her uncomfortable. Then he picked up his knife and continued cutting his meat. At the head of the table, Lucas Hale looked down at his hands. He had remained silent through all of it. He hadn't said a single word in her defense, and she hadn't needed him to, and that was exactly what was killing him. He raised his eyes to the woman sitting in the middle of his dining table, and inside his mind was a line of black type printed on gray paper: Northeast Tissue and Eye Services. And for the first time, instead of thinking about a setup, he thought about 19 years old. The guests had all left by 11 o'clock. He drove her back to Federal Hill, saying nothing in the car, and neither did she, and by the time he returned to his own house, it was nearly 1 in the morning. He didn't turn on the main lights. He went straight into his study and stood before the wall, safe hidden behind the bookcase, and he remained there for 4 minutes before entering the combination. Inside was money, 2 guns, and the deeds to 4 houses, and in the farthest corner, beneath a stack of files he hadn't touched in years, there was an envelope. It was ivory white, slightly yellowed along the edges, with the name of an organization in Boston printed in the upper corner, and in the center, typed beneath a sequence of numbers, were the words, "Donor Letter." The envelope was still sealed. 10 years. He took it, sat down in his chair, and placed it on the desk before him, and he didn't open it. He knew the procedure. They had explained it to him at the hospital, a neatly dressed woman speaking in a practiced voice, saying that sometimes a donor's family sent a letter, and the tissue bank passed it along, and there were no names, no addresses, and the 2 sides would never know each other. He had brought it home, locked it in the safe, and left it unopened, and the reason was simple. So simple that in 10 years he had never needed to speak it aloud. The person who wrote it was dead. That was the only thing he knew for certain about the envelope. They didn't take eyes from the living. Someone had died, and their family had sat somewhere and written a few words to a stranger, and Lucas Hale had decided very early that he didn't want to know. He was carrying on his face what remained of someone whose entire family had mourned them. He had lived for 10 years with that envelope resting inside the safe like a stone in his coat pocket. Now he tore it open. Inside was a sheet of paper folded in half, lined paper, the cheap kind torn from a notebook. The handwriting leaned to the right and had been written quickly. He read. The writer said they didn't know who he was. The writer said they had been told he would go blind without it. Then came one line, and Lucas read it 3 times, before it finally entered his mind. The writer said, "I am going blind too, only more slowly." He sat perfectly still. Somewhere downstairs, the refrigerator ran for a while, then stopped. The writer said, "So I thought this was fairer. One of us shouldn't have to wait." The writer said, "Don't thank me." The writer said, "Gratitude turns it into a debt, and I am not lending this to you. I am giving it to you." Then came the final 2 lines. The writer said, "I ask only one thing of you. When you see someone no one else sees, look for me too." Beneath that there was no signature, only 2 initials, A and V. Lucas Hale sat in the darkness of his study at 1:20 in the morning, the sheet of notebook paper in his hand, and he didn't move for a length of time he would never later be able to measure. He didn't think of her. That was what he would remember afterward, and it would shame him for the rest of his life. His first reaction wasn't to think of her. His first reaction was to calculate. He was Lucas Hale, and he had survived 40 years by calculating, and the machine inside his mind began running before his heart could. A and V, how many people in New England had those initials? Tens of thousands. Tens of thousands. The writer had said they were going blind, and there were thousands of causes of blindness. Coincidence was real, he told himself. Coincidences happened every day. People only remembered the ones they wanted to remember. He set the paper down, stood, walked to the window, and looked out over Federal Hill, at the wet rooftops and a car passing slowly below. He stood there and tried, he truly tried, but the machine inside his mind wouldn't stop, and it kept running, placing each line beside the next as though arranging numbers in a column. 19 years old. Left her job in June of 2016 for medical reasons. Northeast Tissue and Eye Services, Boston. The same year he had lain in that room, the same city. And a blind woman had told him, in a vinyl-floored hallway, at 4 o'clock in the morning, that she knew what it felt like to be left behind, when she couldn't see the person leaving her. And she hadn't asked him a single question when he said someone had given him a piece of their eye. Not one question. And now he stood there and understood that her silence hadn't been indifference. Lucas turned back toward the desk. He picked up the paper and read the 2 initials at the bottom again. He spoke the name aloud, very softly, into the empty room. Amelia Vance, down, and he didn't go anywhere, and he didn't call anyone, because there was one thing Lucas Hale understood better than anyone else in the world. If it was truly her, then for the past 10 years he had been looking at the world through the very thing that had taken the world away from her. On Thursday morning, he went to Boston with Toby and told no one else. Northeast Tissue and Eye Services occupied a low building in Brighton, and they gave Lucas 20 minutes because he had once been a patient, and because he knew how to ask. The woman in records typed into her computer, frowned, typed again, called someone, and finally spoke in the polite voice of a person who had just discovered she was standing beside a hole she hadn't dug. His case file contained the date, the code, and the outcome, but the donor matching information had been removed from the system. She said that couldn't happen by itself. She said someone had to use an authorized login. On the drive back, Toby said he needed 4 days. It took him 6. He traced old payroll records and found 7 people who had worked in the coordination department in 2016, and of those 7, 6 were still employed somewhere, with homes and insurance, while the 7th was a woman named Hallie Boone, 36 years old, living in a weekly rooming house in Quincy. She opened the door with the chain still fastened. The room behind her held only a bed and a dresser, and the smell of old cigarettes. She was so thin that her wrist looked like a child's, and her hands trembled, and the trembling wasn't caused by fear. It had been there before they arrived. It was the kind Toby had seen many times and knew by name. She said she didn't talk to anyone. Lucas said he wasn't the police. She gave a dry laugh and said she knew he wasn't the police, then removed the chain. She sat on the edge of the bed, and Lucas remained standing because there was no chair. He gave her his name. She nodded immediately, without hesitation, and that told him everything he needed to know before she even opened her mouth. He asked about 2016. She stared down at her trembling hands for a long time, then began to speak, and once she started, She couldn't stop, the way people couldn't stop once they had carried something for too long. She said his case hadn't been an ordinary one. Eyes were taken from the dead, always. Everyone knew that. But what he needed hadn't been an entire eye. What he needed was limbal tissue, the thin rim at the edge of the cornea, where the stem cells lived. And when those cells were destroyed by chemicals or fire, the eye could no longer heal itself. It simply grew cloudier until nothing remained. She said that tissue could be taken from a living person. There were laws, there were procedures. It was processed as a living donation, but it bypassed every standard protocol. She said the girl had been 19, already suffering from hereditary endothelial dystrophy, knowing her own sight would fade within 10 to 15 years anyway. But your man, Preston Graves, found her. He brought a briefcase of cash to the clinic's directors and brought in his own surgeons to a wing where the laws didn't reach. Hallie said the medical staff warned the girl that donating her healthy stem cells would accelerate her own blindness, pulling her into total darkness years ahead of her time. Graves offered her a fortune to save your sight, but the girl refused every single dollar. She told them she wouldn't sell a piece of herself to a stranger, but she would give it freely under one condition, that you would never know her name. She signed the waiver with Graves's lawyers standing over her. Hallie Boone said she never saw such a fierce, terrifying gentleness in all her years of doing that work. In the rooming house in Quincy, a truck passed outside. Lucas stood there and couldn't speak a single word. Then he asked the final question. He asked who had removed the file. Hallie lowered her head. She said it had happened 3 weeks earlier. She said she knew it was wrong. She knew. But she owed money and had owed money for 4 years, and the man had offered cash and said it wouldn't hurt anyone, that he was only cleaning up an old file. She said she still had her login because no one had bothered to deactivate it when she left. Lucas asked who the man was. She said she didn't know his name. She said he wore a suit, salt and pepper hair. He spoke like a lawyer, very politely, very calmly, never threatening her even once, and she had been more afraid of him than of every man who had ever threatened her. Then she revealed the detail that made the entire room turn cold. She said he hadn't asked about Miss Vance. She said he had asked only one question, again and again, 3 times in 3 different ways, about who in the system could still trace the donor connected to Lucas Hale's file. Lucas Hale stood perfectly still in the middle of that rooming house in Quincy, and outside the rain began to fall, and he said nothing, and Toby looked at his face and instinctively stepped back half a pace. Lucas didn't name anyone to Toby. He only told him to keep digging, then added a sentence Toby had never heard him say in 8 years. Don't report to anyone else. It took Toby 9 days. He began with the easiest place, the place no one ever started because everyone believed it had already been settled, the file on the car explosion in 2016. For 10 years, everyone had known the Fall River family was responsible, and everyone knew because 2 months later, 3 of their men were dead and the matter was considered closed. Toby pulled out the old file and read it as though he had never known the conclusion. 3 weeks later, he sat with Lucas in the empty parking lot of a shuttered church on Chalkstone Avenue and gave him the first thing he had found. He said the bomb had detonated early. According to the federal forensic report that no one had bothered to read carefully, the device exploded only moments after Lucas sat down, while the person who planted it had intended for it to detonate once the car began moving, and the difference was about 4 seconds. Toby said those 4 seconds were the reason Lucas was still sitting there. Lucas said nothing. Toby gave him the second thing. He said no one in the Fall River family knew how to build that kind of device. He had checked. They used guns. They always used guns. The device in Lucas's car had been built with a timer, and in New England that year, only 3 men could make one like it, and one of those 3 had died of cancer in 2021, and before he died, he had spoken to a man Toby down in Cranston. The bomb maker said the person who hired him wasn't from Fall River. He said the man had paid him cash inside a paper envelope, wore a suit, and spoke like a lawyer. The car remained silent for a long time. Then Toby gave him the third thing, and he delivered it in the voice of a man who understood exactly what he was holding. He asked whether Lucas remembered who had signed his hospital admission papers, who had signed the surgical consent forms while Lucas was unconscious, who had dealt with the hospital, the insurance company, and the tissue bank, who had sat in the hallway for 11 days, and who had been the only person in the organization permitted to handle all of Lucas's medical records. Lucas looked through the window. He didn't need to answer. Toby said that person had traced the donor's name. Not now, he said, in 2016. He had known since that year. He had known for 10 years. And Lucas Hale sat in the parking lot of a shuttered church and finally saw the shape of the thing that had lived beside him for a decade. He didn't shout. He didn't strike anything. He sat perfectly still with both hands resting on his thighs, and he fitted the final piece into place. The piece Toby didn't need to speak because only Lucas could understand it. As long as Lucas didn't know who had given him light, there was only one person in his mind who had stood there while he lay in darkness. One person who signed the papers, one person who sat in the hallway, one person Lucas had never questioned, never investigated, never doubted for 10 years, because somewhere deep inside, he believed he owed that man the sight he still had. That wasn't loyalty. It was a price constructed with exquisite care, and Lucas had paid it every day for 10 years without ever knowing whom he was paying. Then Lucas spoke for the first time in 20 minutes, and his voice was completely ordinary, and that's what sent a chill down Toby's spine. He asked why now. He asked why there had been 10 years of silence, only for someone to remove an old file 3 weeks ago. Toby couldn't answer, but Lucas could, and he did it slowly, joining the pieces one by one as he sat inside the car in the empty parking lot. 3 weeks earlier, a man had walked into a diner on Cranston Street and sat down across from a blind woman. 3 weeks earlier, the man sitting beside him had seen those two initials seated barely 2 feet from his employer, sharing a bowl of soup with him. Lucas closed his eyes. He thought about the plastic can, the smell, the sleeping bag, and he understood the final thing, and it was something he would carry for the rest of his life. Those men hadn't been hired to drive her away. She had no home. If they forced her out from beneath one bridge, she would move beneath another. That person didn't need her to leave. That person needed her to cease existing, and he knew exactly how to make it happen without anyone having to lay a hand on her. Take away a homeless woman's sleeping bag at the end of November in Rhode Island. Homeless people froze to death every winter in that state. No one investigated. No one wrote about them. No one counted them. He arrived on Federal Hill at 9 o'clock that night, with the sheet of notebook paper tucked inside the breast pocket of his coat, and he stood outside the third-floor door for 2 minutes before knocking. Amelia opened it. She had recognized him from the hallway, because she had stored the rhythm of his footsteps in its fixed place long ago. But tonight it didn't fit again, and she stood in the doorway and told him he was walking unevenly. She said his right side was carrying more weight. She asked what had happened. Lucas didn't answer. He stepped inside, closed the door, and stood in the middle of the empty apartment, while Bruno lifted his head from the floor and lowered it again, and the refrigerator hummed in the kitchen. Then Lucas Hale dropped to his knees. He hadn't intended to do it. His legs moved before his mind could stop them, and it was only the second time in his life that his body had made a decision for him, the first being when he rose from his chair in Hollis' kitchen without saying thank you. He knelt on the hardwood floor before her and said it was her. He said all that time it had been her. Amelia stood perfectly still. She heard his knees touch the floor and understood at once what was happening. And she didn't ask how he knew, and she didn't ask whether he was certain. She simply stood there while the whole room waited for her to cry, and she didn't. She said, "So what?" 2 words. Lucas looked up, and for 1 second he thought he had misheard her. He said he owed her. He hadn't finished the sentence before she cut him off, and she didn't raise her voice, and that was why it cut so deeply. She said no. She said she had already written it in the letter. She said she had written it very clearly so there would never be a scene like this. Then she spoke the words Lucas would carry for the rest of his life. She said, "I didn't lend it to you." She said, "If you turn it into a debt, then you stain the only thing in my life I ever did right." He couldn't speak. Amelia turned, reached down, found Bruno beneath her palm, and rested her hand on his head, and she straightened. She said she knew what he was thinking. He was making a list, a house, a sum of money, a doctor in Switzerland. His men posted at the end of the street where she slept. He thought that was generosity. She asked whether he understood. She said he was doing exactly what Mr. Graves had done at the dinner table that night. He was putting a price on a gift. She said Mr. Graves called it a price because that was the only word he had. She said Lucas called it a debt, and debts could be repaid. And once it was repaid, he would be finished, he would feel lighter, and he would go home. Then she spoke the final sentence very softly, and it was the worst thing anyone had ever said to Lucas Hale. She said he had learned more from that man than he realized. Lucas knelt on the floor of his own apartment and understood that she was right. For 2 days, ever since he had read that sheet of notebook paper, the machine inside his mind had been running without pause, doing only one thing: calculating what could repay this. It hadn't stopped for even a second to ask what she wanted. It hadn't asked because in the entire system Lucas Hale had used to survive for 40 years, everything that came in had to be answered by something going out, and he had mistaken that for honor. He said he didn't know any other way. Amelia said she knew. She said that was the saddest thing about him. Then she sat down on the floor beside the dog with her back against the wall and said in an ordinary voice, almost wearily, that she had been 19. She said they had asked her 3 times. She said that Doctor had been the kindest man she had ever met, and he had tried with everything he had to make her say no. She said she sat there and thought about something very simple that no one else in the room had considered. She said, I was going to lose it either way. You weren't, she said, so why should both of us have to wait? She said she didn't regret it. She said she had lived 10 years in darkness and had lost her job, her home, everyone, and in those 10 years, there had been exactly one day when she knew with certainty that she had done the right thing. And she said that was the only possession she had left, and if he paid her for it, then she would lose that too. She asked whether he understood now. Lucas didn't stand. He lowered himself to the hardwood floor about 6 feet away from her, and he didn't touch her, and she didn't touch him. He sat there for a very long time. Then he said he had to tell her something about the person who had burned her sleeping bag. And Amelia turned her head toward him, and this time she was the one who stopped breathing. Preston Graves didn't run. That was what Lucas hadn't anticipated, and later he would admit it was because he still thought of Preston as a man driven by fear, when Preston had never been afraid of anything. On Monday morning, Preston called a meeting. He had the authority to do it, and he summoned both capos and invited a man from Fall River to serve as arbitrator, a 72-year-old man everyone along the East Coast called Uncle, and no one dared refuse. The meeting took place upstairs in a closed restaurant on Atwells Avenue. Preston spoke first. He spoke for 35 minutes and never raised his voice once. He spoke about a man who hadn't gone to the harbor in 4 straight weeks. He spoke about his employer missing a meeting with New Bedford so he could sit in a diner. He spoke about that man driving himself at 1 o'clock in the morning for 35 minutes to take a dog to the hospital. He delivered those words as though it pained him to say them, and one of the 2 capos lowered his eyes. Then Preston placed a folder on the table. He said it was a file he hadn't wanted to possess. Inside were photographs of an account, 3 money transfers totaling $11,000, and the recipient's name was Amelia Vance. While the source of the money led back to a shell company, everyone at that table knew belonged to Lucas. Everyone believed it. They believed it because Preston Graves hadn't placed a single false thing on a table in 10 years, and they believed it because what he had just said matched what they themselves had been thinking for 4 weeks, but hadn't dared speak aloud. Uncle from Fall River tapped 2 fingers against the tabletop. I asked whether Lucas had anything to say. Lucas sat at the head of the table and said nothing. Then the door opened. No one led her inside. That was the detail all 4 men in that room would remember forever. She entered alone, her left hand resting on Bruno's shoulder, and she walked straight ahead without searching, without touching the wall, because she had counted from the foot of the stairs, 19 steps, then 7 paces to the door, then 4 steps into the room, and Toby had read those instructions to her 3 times in the car. She stopped precisely at the edge of the table. In a perfectly polite voice, Preston said this was a family matter, Miss Vance. Amelia didn't answer him. She placed something on the table. It was small, made of black plastic, and it made a faint click against the wood. A cassette tape. She said he had removed the file from Northeast. She said he was good. Truly, he had found exactly the right person, someone who owed money and still had a login, because no one had bothered to deactivate it. She said he had erased the name from the server, and inside the server, there truly was nothing left. Then she said the part no one in that room understood except him. She said he had forgotten one thing. She said she had worked there for 11 months. She said every call into the coordination office was recorded. Not because they enjoyed recording people, because federal law required records for all human tissue to be preserved for many years, and that system had been installed in 1998, and it recorded onto tape, and no one had ever digitized it because there was no budget, and because no one imagined the day would ever come when it was needed. She said the tapes weren't stored on a computer. They were in cardboard boxes in the basement. She had known exactly which box to look for because she was the one who stacked them, and Toby was the one who quietly went down there to retrieve it for her. Then she turned her face toward exactly where he sat and spoke the words. She said, "You could buy the server, Mr. Graves. You couldn't buy the basement." Toby connected the machine. No one stopped him. Uncle from Fall River looked at Preston, and Preston didn't move, and Toby pressed play. There was a hiss. Then came a man's voice, distorted by 10 years in magnetic tape, but no one in that room could mistake it. Not one of them. The voice said, "I need to know exactly who the donor is." Then it listened for a moment, then it said no. It said he mustn't know. It said never. The tape continued, then stopped. No one in the room breathed. Toby didn't remove the cassette. He said there was another recording, rewound the tape, and explained that it had been made from the same telephone number on the same night, 8 hours earlier. Then he pressed play. The same voice came through, cold and urgent, demanding to know if the donor match for Lucas Hale was secured. The voice said, "I don't care about the ethics board. He is arriving at the hospital now. Make sure the transplant happens tonight. Do it now." The tape reached its end, hissed, and stopped completely, and that hiss lasted 3 seconds inside the silent room. Uncle from Fall River placed both hands on the table very slowly. One capo rose from his chair and stepped backward, not toward Preston, but away from him. Preston Graves sat with his spine straight, his hands still resting on the false folder he had brought, and his face didn't redden, and he didn't breathe in. And Amelia Vance stood at the edge of the table inside her absolute darkness, one hand resting on the dog's shoulder, and she couldn't see a single face in the room, but she heard everything, and she knew exactly what had just broken. Lucas Hale rose to his feet, and the gun was out of his coat before anyone could say a word. No one in the room tried to stop him. Uncle from Fall River didn't move. The 2 capos stepped back. Preston Graves remained seated and lifted his face, and he didn't beg. And that was the most frightening thing of all, because he knew exactly what was about to happen and waited for it with the expression of a man being proven right. Then a very quiet voice came from the edge of the table. Amelia said, "Lucas." She said, "If you pull that trigger, you will still be looking through my eye." She said, "I asked one thing of you, only one thing in 10 years, and I wrote it down on paper." She told him to look at that man, to look carefully. She said, "He isn't worth becoming what he wants you to become." Lucas stood there for a very long time. His hand didn't tremble. Then he lowered the gun, placed it on the table, and pushed it toward the center. He looked at Uncle from Fall River and said, "I am handing him over to you, along with the tape." In that world, there were things a man wasn't permitted to do with his own hands, because if he did, it became personal revenge. But if the traitor's own associates passed judgment, then it became law. They led Preston Graves toward the door. He stopped exactly where Amelia stood and asked, still polite, still calm, what she had gained. He said she was still blind. She still had nothing. Amelia didn't turn her head toward him. She only said, "I have a place to sit. You are about to lose your place at the table." Those were the last words anyone in this story ever spoke to Preston Graves. 1 year later, on a November afternoon, a wooden sign was hung above a brick building that had been burned black 3 years earlier on a road called Quarry Road. Lucas Hale had offered her everything before that. A house in her name, enough money to support 3 lifetimes, a doctor in Zurich whom he had flown to meet and paid in advance. Amelia refused all of it, and she didn't refuse harshly. She only said, "My disease can't be cured, and you know that because you have read my file." Then she said the rest slowly. She said, "I don't regret it." She said, "In 10 years of living in darkness, there has been exactly one day when I knew with certainty that I had done the right thing, and that is the only possession I have." She asked, "If you erase that, what do I have left?" Lucas sat very still for a long time, then asked what he could do, and Amelia said, "Don't do anything for me. Sit with me." Lucas Hale didn't retire. He didn't enter a monastery, he didn't turn himself in, and he didn't give any speeches. And anyone who tells you that a man like him changes overnight is trying to sell you a story. But over the next 6 months, He quietly withdrew his family from 3 lines of business without explaining himself to anyone. He abandoned the weekly rooming houses on the south side. He shut down every payday lending operation in neighborhoods where people borrowed $200 to buy medicine for their children. And he sent people across the state to close every remaining place like Quarry Road. And this time, he didn't burn anything. He called rescue organizations and paid them. He didn't do it because he had become a good man. He did it because for the first time in 40 years, he had seen the face of the person paying the price for those lines of profit. And once a person had been seen, there was a way to make them invisible again. The diner was called the Second Chair. It wasn't a charity. It had a menu and prices, and those who could pay did, while those who couldn't sat down and ate, and no one asked a single question. That was the only rule written on the wall. No one here will be asked why they are hungry. And at every table, whether the room was crowded or nearly empty, one chair was always left open. Edith Hollis ran the place. She was 64 years old and said she was too old for this, yet she arrived at exactly 6 o'clock every morning. Tobias Rend washed dishes on Tuesday nights, and no one in the organization dared tease him about it. Bruno was older, he was much slower, and those 2 ribs still made him walk slightly unevenly on cold days, and he lay beneath the last table like a great black stone. And before Amelia took the first bite of every meal, she still bent down and poured some into the bottle cap on the floor. Bruno still ate first. Bruno always ate first. On the afternoon of the grand opening, the room was full. The mayor was there, reporters were there, and men from the family wearing suits stood beside men who had been sleeping on the streets for 3 years, and Lucas Hale crossed the entire room while people moved aside for him, as they always had. He stopped at the last table, and he asked if he could sit with her. Amelia tilted her head toward the voice, toward the rhythm of those footsteps she had kept in their fixed place for an entire year, and she smiled and said, "You have been sitting here for a long time already." He sat down. A little later, when she rose to leave, she reached out, and Lucas Hale didn't take her wrist. He bent his left elbow, held it level with his hip, and waited. She found it, her fingers closing around the joint, and she stepped back half a pace, and they walked that way across the entire room, the man half a step ahead to tell her where the ground was, and the woman behind him, still the one choosing to walk. On the wall near the door was a small wooden plaque carved by Lucas himself. It said that some people don't change the world by standing above it. They change it by keeping a place open at the table. Beneath it, in Braille, with every dot pressed by Amelia's own hand, were 3 words: "Sit with us." This story isn't about a powerful man saving a poor woman. It is about the opposite, and it speaks to something we often forget in our daily lives. A person's dignity isn't something we grant them. It already belongs to them, and the only thing we can do is recognize it. The person sitting at the last table of a diner, the person sleeping beneath an awning, the person asking for help at an intersection, they don't need our pity. They need us to see them. And there is one very simple truth taught a man who had spent his entire life giving orders. When you help someone, don't pull them along. Offer your elbow and let them remain the one who chooses to walk, because kindness that becomes a debt is no longer kindness. It is only an invoice written in more beautiful words. If this story touched you, please subscribe to our channel, press like, and share it so that together we can hear more meaningful stories every day. And I truly want to know how this story made you feel. Has anyone in your life ever kept a place open for you at a time when you felt invisible? Or is there someone you once walked past when perhaps you should have stopped? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single line, and we sincerely want to hear what lies deep within your heart. I wish everyone watching this video abundant health, a joyful life, and peace in each passing day. Goodbye, and I will see you again in the next video.